The snow came down that morning, but it wasn't the kind of snow you see on a postcard. This was a cold, hard snow, like chips of bone falling from a gray sky. It clung to the platform of Coldwater Station, gathering in the corners of windows like a silent accusation. The train had left an hour ago. Its ghost still hung in the air, a memory of steam and noise. But now there was only silence, and one girl who refused to move. Her name was Loretta Vale. She stood by a crooked fence, a letter crushed in her fist. She wasn't crying anymore. The tears had frozen somewhere on the long ride from Missouri. The letter was simple. 2 words: I decline. A few feet away stood the man she'd written it for. Boone Calder, the rancher. He was bigger than his photograph. A mountain of a man, with a face the wind had been working on for years. His eyes weren't looking for a wife. They were looking for a worker, for someone who would bend. Loretta met his gaze. I won't go with you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Boone didn't even flinch. You came all this way. I changed my mind. His jaw tightened. He thought it was because he was old, because he was coarse. She didn't answer. The truth was, she'd been ready for all that. What she wasn't ready for was the feeling of being bought, like a mule, like a sack of flour. He hadn't even asked her name. A gust of wind cut between them. Suit yourself, Boone said. And then he turned. He walked to his wagon, climbed in, and drove away without a single look back. The sound of the wheels vanished into the white. Loretta was alone. Or so she thought. She stayed there as the sky grew darker and the snow piled up. The station master eventually took pity, letting her sleep on a bench inside. She curled up, the cold seeping into her bones. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her dead mother's face. She saw the life she was running from. She was 22 years old and felt like she'd already lived 1,000 years. But what Loretta didn't know, as she shivered on that hard wooden bench, was that she was not alone. Someone had been watching her from the shadows of the depot. Someone who knew all about the letter, because she was the one who made sure Loretta left it behind. The morning light was thin and gray. Loretta stirred, every muscle aching. When she sat up, a figure was standing across from her. You look awful, a familiar voice said. It was her sister, Maybelle. What are you doing here? Loretta gasped. Maybelle was younger, but always seemed older. Quieter, sharper. She held up a piece of paper. The letter. You never posted this, Maybelle said. You tucked it under your mattress. Loretta could only stare. Her sister had read her private thoughts, packed a bag, and followed her halfway across the country. You were going to throw it all away, Maybelle said, her voice flat. Just because you got scared. I wasn't scared. Yes, you were. Maybelle stepped closer, her eyes like chips of ice. You say no to men like him, and it makes you feel powerful. But you always end up alone. The words hit Loretta harder than the cold. He didn't even ask my name, Loretta whispered. A strange, sad smile touched Maybelle's lips. Then maybe he'll ask me mine. What? I'm going to take your place. You can't, Loretta stammered, her hands shaking. Watch me, Maybelle said. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me. I've spent my whole life in your shadow, waiting for a chance. This is it. It might not be love, but it's a life. It's a roof over my head. She was turning Loretta's act of defiance into a transaction of her own. Maybelle walked to the door of the depot and looked out at the endless snow. She wasn't looking for a husband. She was looking for an escape. And she had a secret that Loretta knew nothing about. A secret that had driven her all this way, a reason far darker than just wanting a home. She was running from something back in Missouri, and she believed a place this cold, this empty, was the only place she could ever be safe. Boone Calder did not expect to see anyone waiting for him when he rode back into town. But there she stood, not the one who had refused him, the other one, the sister. "I'm Maybelle," she said, looking him right in the eye. No fear, no hesitation. Boone's face was stone. He looked from her to the empty space where her sister had been. "I'm not Loretta," she said, "but you paid for a bride, and I came in her place." He stared at her for a long, hard moment. His eyes weren't just looking at her face. They were searching for something else, a flicker of weakness, a hint of the same pride that had cost him his first choice. He saw none. Slowly he nodded. Just once. The wagon ride to the ranch was a silent war. The groan of the wheels, the wind, the heavy weight of Boone's presence beside her. Maybelle didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, her back rigid. As they passed through what little town there was, people stopped and stared. They pointed. They whispered. The substitute bride. The second choice. Maybelle felt their eyes on her like stones, but she didn't flinch. She folded her hands in her lap like a lady and stared back until they looked away. When they finally reached the Calder estate, it wasn't a home. It was a fortress against the world. Fences sharp and straight. A house built of dark wood with windows like vacant eyes. Boone helped her down from the wagon. His hand was like bark, rough, impersonal. Inside, it was even colder. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else. Regret. A room had been prepared, the one meant for Loretta. A bed neatly made, a fire already built, crackling in the hearth. He grunted. "Stew in the kitchen." Then he turned and walked down the long, dim corridor, his boots echoing on the pine floors. He didn't look back. Mabel closed the door and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She was in. She had made it. But as she looked around the cold, empty room, a new fear began to creep in. It wasn't the fear of being alone with a strange man. It was the fear that she had just walked into a cage far worse than the one she'd left behind. And as the wind howled outside, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the wall above the fireplace was a faint outline in the dust, the shape of a crucifix that had been recently and violently torn down. The next morning, Maybelle woke to a silence that felt heavy. The fire was dead. The room was freezing. No one had come to check on her. She dressed quickly, her hands numb. The house was a maze of closed doors and long, creaking hallways. A large, ornate mirror on the wall caught her reflection, and for a second, she thought she saw someone standing behind her. She spun around. Nothing, just shadows. In the kitchen, a woman stood at the stove, stirring a pot. She was tall and thin, with gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin on her face. She didn't smile. "You're the sister," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Boone's out. He rides early." The woman's name was Enid. Her eyes were pale and held no welcome. Mabel didn't ask permission. She poured herself a coffee and sat at the table. She was done being a ghost in someone else's house. Boone returned with the sunrise, his shoulders dusted with snow. He glanced at Maybelle, but his nod was for Enid. They moved around each other in a practiced, silent rhythm. He finally spoke, not to her, but at her. "You'll need boots." "I didn't expect to be working the grounds," she said, her voice steady. "Snow lasts half the year," he grunted. "A body can only sit so long before the mind rots." She understood him perfectly. He was talking about himself. That day she walked the ranch. It was a place built for function, not comfort. No flowers, no paint. A place where survival was the only decoration. As she stood by a fence overlooking a frozen creek, she felt a profound loneliness. This man, Boone, had built a world designed to keep everyone out. And then he had invited her in. Why? The question echoed in the vast, empty landscape. That night she sat by the fire, mending a torn sheet. Enid was there, darning socks, her lips pressed into a thin line. Boone sat in the shadows, reading a ledger. "I can help," Maybelle said to the silence. "You're helping by sitting still," Enid snapped. Boone didn't even look up. Later, in her cold room, Maybelle felt a strange weight in her chest. Not sadness, waiting, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The days that followed were a trial. In town, she was an outcast. The whispers followed her everywhere. The substitute, the one who stayed. The shame was a constant, dull ache. But Maybelle did not break. She learned the rhythms of the house, swept floors, fed chickens, wrote letters home she knew she would never send. One morning, a pair of worn but sturdy boots appeared outside her door, lined with rabbit fur. Boone never said a word about them, but she wore them. A week later, she cut her hand on an axe while chopping kindling. Boone saw it happen, said nothing. That evening, a roll of clean bandage and a tin of salve were sitting by her plate at dinner. It wasn't kindness. It was a language of quiet, practical things, a language she was beginning to understand. That night, Enid's cold silence finally broke. "Why'd your sister really leave?" she asked, her voice low. Maybelle paused. "She was afraid she would disappear here." Enid looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "And you?" "I was afraid I wouldn't." Later, as she sat with her embroidery, her stitches uneven, Boone spoke from the shadows. "You're pulling the thread too tight." She looked up, surprised. "You sew?" "No," he said, not looking up from his book. "But I watch." It was the first time he had truly seen her. And as the fire crackled, she felt a tiny spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. But then, walking back to her room, she passed his study. The door was ajar. She heard him speaking, a single word spoken into the darkness with a chilling mix of anger and grief. A name. And it wasn't Loretta. It wasn't Maybelle. It was a name she had never heard before. Ilara. The cold snap that week wasn't just weather. It was a warning. The wind had teeth. It gnawed at the house, rattling the windows and piling snow against the doors. Boone rode out every day, pushing himself and his horse against the storm. He came back later and later, his face raw, a grim tension in his jaw. Maybelle watched him go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. He was riding like a man trying to outrun a memory. On the third night, he didn't come back at all. Enid said nothing, just left a pot of stew on the stove and retreated into her stony silence. But Maybelle saw the fear in her eyes. It was an old fear, a familiar one. Maybelle didn't sleep. She sat in a rocking chair by the dying fire, watching the blizzard swallow the world. Just before dawn, she heard it. The desperate clatter of hooves. The front door burst open. Boone stumbled in, half frozen, his shirt torn and bloodied at the shoulder. He was limping badly. "Horse slipped," he growled through chattering teeth. "Near the ravine." But Maybelle saw the look on his face. It wasn't just pain, it was fury. This was no accident. She and Enid moved without speaking, a practiced drill that felt chillingly routine. They got him to a chair, peeled off his frozen coat. The wound was a deep, ugly gash along his upper arm. "You should have sent for help," she whispered, her hands surprisingly steady as she cleaned the wound. "There's no one else to send," he said, his eyes closed. The words hung in the air. This fortress he'd built had become his prison. Later, with the wound dressed, he lay in his bed, pale and still. Maybelle sat with him, listening to his shallow breathing. Around midnight, he began to mutter in a feverish sleep. "Alara, don't." Maybelle leaned closer, the name again. "No," she whispered into the quiet room, more to herself than to him. "I'm not her." He didn't wake, but the air in the room seemed to shift, as if a ghost had just been acknowledged. For 3 days he drifted. Maybelle did not leave his side. She changed his bandages, spoon-fed him broth. She read to him from one of his books, the sound of her voice a steady anchor in the storm of his fever. On the second night, while searching for more linens in a dusty chest at the foot of his bed, her hand brushed against something hard. It was a small wooden box, not locked. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were 2 things: a single pressed flower, a lilac, now brown and brittle with age, and a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird. It was beautiful, the work of a patient, gentle hand, but it was the initials carved into the bottom that made her breath catch. E.V. Alara, and her own last name, Vale. Boone woke on the 4th day, his eyes clear for the first time. He looked at Maybelle sitting by his bed. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy. She just nodded. "You shouldn't ride alone in that kind of weather," she said softly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Didn't plan to fall." "You never do." That evening Boone sat in the parlor, his arm in a sling, watching the fire. Maybelle sat across from him, sewing. The silence was different now, not empty but filled with unspoken things. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked suddenly. "Of what?" "Being strong." "All the time," she admitted. He looked at her hands. Her stitch work was neater now, confident. "You taught yourself," he observed. "There was no one else to teach me." Boone leaned his head back. "Something we have in common." And just like that, the space between them shrank. It wasn't love, it was recognition. 2 lonely souls recognizing the shape of their own solitude in the other. But the mystery of Alara Vale haunted Maybelle. A sister? A cousin? Someone from her own family, connected to this broken man in a way she couldn't understand. The whispers in town grew louder. A supply boy let it slip. They were calling her Boone's nursemaid, the sister who was earning her keep on her back. Boone heard it. He said nothing. But that night, he did something strange. He built a small shelf in the parlor, right next to her rocking chair. He placed 2 of her books on it. It was his way of saying, "This is your space. You belong here." One morning, as she was brushing snow from the porch, he handed her a small, wrapped bundle. Inside was a pair of hand-stitched leather gloves. The seams were clumsy, but they were lined with the softest rabbit fur. "You said yours didn't fit," he mumbled, not looking at her. "Did you make these?" she asked, her voice thick. "I tried." She slipped them on. They fit perfectly. "I don't always know how to say things," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. "You don't have to," she answered. "You just did." The warmth spreading through her hands had nothing to do with the fur lining. But the peace was short-lived. That afternoon, a man rode into the yard. He was handsome, dressed in fine clothes that looked out of place against the harsh landscape. His name was Harlan Finch. And the moment Boone saw him, his face hardened into a mask of pure hatred. Harlan didn't look at Boone. His eyes found Maybelle. He smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "He replaced her with a newer model. Tell me, does he still call out her name in his sleep?" "Get off my land!" Boone's voice was a low growl, each word packed with years of cold fury. Harlan Finch just laughed, a sound that didn't belong in the quiet snow. He swung down from his horse, his movements easy and arrogant. "It's not your land, Calder," he sneered. Not all of it. The northern parcel is mine. The deed was signed. The deed was a lie. Harlan's eyes flickered to Maybelle, who stood frozen on the porch. You must be the sister. Loretta, is it? I'm Maybelle, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Maybelle Vale, Harlan mused, tasting the name. Of course, another Vale woman come to this miserable place. History does like to repeat itself, doesn't it? What did he mean? The initials on the carving, E.V. Ilara Vale. Say what you came to say, Finch, Boone cut in, taking a step forward. I came to give you a warning. I filed a claim. You have until the spring thaw to clear off that parcel, or I'll clear it for you. He looked past Boone, directly at Maybelle again. This isn't the life for a pretty thing like you. This place, it breaks things. His eyes held a cruel, knowing glint. He knew the secrets of this house. After he rode off, leaving a trail of threats hanging in the cold air, Boone turned and walked toward the barn without a word. The door slammed shut behind him. Mabel found Enid in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. Who is Ilara Vale? Mabel demanded. Enid turned, her face a gray mask of grief. You have no right to ask that name in this house. That carving in his room had her initials, my last name. Was she our kin? A cousin? An aunt? She was my daughter, Enid said, the words falling like stones. And she was his wife. The floor seemed to drop out from under Maybelle. Boone had been married before, to Enid's daughter, to a woman from her own family she had never even heard of. What happened to her? Maybelle whispered. He broke her, Enid said, her voice filled with venom. This land, his silence, it swallowed her whole. She's gone. But Maybelle saw the lie in her eyes. It wasn't the whole story. That night the house felt haunted. Mabel couldn't sleep. She crept down the hallway to Boone's study. The door was unlocked. Inside she found a small desk. In the top drawer, beneath a stack of old ledgers, was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. Her hands trembled as she opened the first one. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. The words were a torrent of despair, love, and fear. They were love letters. But they weren't written to Boone. They were written to Harlan Finch. And they were signed, Yours forever, Ilara. The letters told a story of secrets and betrayal. Ilara Vale, Enid's daughter, and a distant cousin of Maybelle's, had been Boone's young, beautiful wife. But she'd found life on the ranch suffocating. She'd felt trapped by Boone's quiet, demanding nature. And she had found comfort in the arms of another man, Harlan Finch. They had planned to run away together. The letters were filled with their plans. Harlan was supposed to secure the deed to the northern parcel of Boone's land, Ilara's dowry, and they would use it to start a new life. But the last letter was different. It was frantic, terrified. He knows, Ilara had written. Boone knows everything. I have to leave tonight. Meet me at the ravine. Don't fail me, my love. The ravine, the same place Boone's horse had slipped. Maybelle felt sick. She put the letters back, her mind reeling. Enid had said Boone broke her, that the land swallowed her, but the letters painted a different picture. Ilara had run away. Or had she? The next day, a strange feeling of resolve settled over Maybelle. She was no longer just a substitute. She was a part of this story now, woven into its dark fabric. She found Boone by the fence line, testing a post. I know about Ilara, she said quietly. He stiffened, his back to her. There's nothing to know. She was married to you. She was my cousin. He slowly turned, his face unreadable. She's gone. Did she run away with Harlan Finch? Maybelle pressed, her heart pounding. For a moment she thought he would explode, his hands clenched into fists. But then, the anger seemed to drain out of him. leaving behind something hollow and exhausted. Yes, he said, the word raw. Enid blames you. I know. He had lived with that blame, with the shame and the whispers, for years. He had walled himself off, letting the world think the worst of him, because the truth was somehow even more painful. That night something changed between them. The secrets were out. The ghosts were named. As they sat by the fire, Maybelle finally confronted the last piece of the puzzle. The day my sister refused you, she began, when you came back to town and found me. You weren't just surprised to see me. You were looking for something. What was it? Boone stared into the flames for a long time. When Loretta wrote, he said, his voice low. She signed her letter, Loretta Vale of Missouri. I didn't think anything of it. But when she refused me, I thought maybe it was a sign, that the name Vale was cursed, that I was meant to be alone. He finally looked at her. When I saw you, I saw her, for a second. You have her eyes. Alara's eyes. Enid had said the same thing. But you're not her, he continued, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Alara was like a wildfire, beautiful and wild, and she burned everything she touched. You're like the fire in the hearth. You give warmth. You push back the cold. In that moment, Maybelle understood. He hadn't just accepted a substitute. He had seen a chance for a different life. A second chance he was too afraid to ask for. But their fragile peace was about to be shattered. A few days later, a telegram arrived. It was from her sister, Loretta. It said she was coming back, not just to visit. The telegram read, "Arriving on the 15th to bring you home. I've spoken with Mr. Finch. He has told me everything about the kind of man you are living with. Pack your bags." Loretta's return was not a rescue. It was an invasion. She arrived in a hired carriage, dressed in fine clothes that screamed of city life. She looked at the Stark ranch, at Maybelle in her simple work dress, and her face was a mask of pity and disgust. "I'm taking you home," she announced, as if Maybelle were a lost child. "I am home," Maybelle said, her voice steady. "This is not a home, it's a prison. Harlan Finch told me what happened here. He told me how this man drove our cousin to her death." "He lied," Maybelle said. Boone appeared on the porch behind her. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent, powerful presence at her back. "Loretta, you need to leave," Maybelle said. "Not without you." "You didn't come here for me," Maybelle said, the truth hitting her with sudden clarity. "You came here because you couldn't stand the thought of me being happy. You came here because Harlan Finch, a handsome, charming man, whispered poison in your ear, and you believed him, because it's what you wanted to believe." Loretta flinched, the accusation hitting its mark. Just then, another rider appeared. Harlan Finch, a triumphant smirk on his face. He had orchestrated this. He'd used Loretta as a weapon to break them apart. "See, Calder?" Harlan called out. "The whole world knows what you are. You can't hide it." "I'm not hiding anymore," Boone said, his voice calm and clear. He stepped forward, standing beside Maybelle. "Alara made her choice," Boone said, speaking to the memory as much as to the man. "She chose you, and she chose to try and steal my land." "A lie!" Harlan roared. "No," Maybelle said, stepping forward. "It's the truth. I found her letters." The smirk vanished from Harlan's face. Panic flickered in his eyes. "Those letters prove she was trying to defraud my husband of his land," Maybelle announced, her voice ringing with newfound power. "And they mentioned meeting you at the ravine on the night she disappeared, the same ravine where my husband was mysteriously injured a few weeks ago." The implication hung in the air, thick and dangerous. Harlan hadn't just been Alara's lover. He was a thief, and maybe something much worse. "What are you saying?" Loretta whispered, horrified. I'm saying Mr. Finch has been playing a very long, very dangerous game, Maybelle said, her eyes locked on Harlan. Harlan's bravado crumbled. He looked from Maybelle's resolute face to Boone's cold, steady gaze and knew he had lost. He had underestimated the quiet sister. He had underestimated the broken rancher. He backed his horse away, spat on the ground, and rode off, swallowed by the vast landscape that had kept his secrets for so long. Loretta stood there, utterly defeated. She looked at her sister, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a victim, but a woman of incredible strength. A woman who had found her place. Without another word, Loretta turned and got back in her carriage. As it pulled away, Boone turned to Maybelle. The silence that fell between them was not empty. It was filled with everything they had survived together. "He asked me to marry him," Maybelle said softly. Boone looked confused. "Who did?" "You did. You said you would if I asked." A slow understanding dawned on his face. "I'm not good with words," he said, his old excuse. "Then show me," she whispered. He stepped forward and took her hands. They were calloused and warm. His hands. "Maybelle Vale," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am asking you to stay. Not as a substitute, not as a sister, as my wife." Her answer wasn't a word. It was the way she leaned into him, the way she finally let the strength she'd held onto for so long rest in his arms. It was the first time she felt truly safe. In the spring, when the snow finally melted and the ground softened, they didn't just mend fences. They planted a garden. Along the fence line where the wind blew coldest, they planted rows of lilacs. Boone dug the holes in the rich, dark earth. Maybelle gently placed each plant, speaking to them softly, as if they were children. The town still whispered, of course. They always would. About the sister who left and the one who stayed. About the cold rancher who seemed to find his soul that long winter. But Maybelle and Boone didn't hear them. They had their own language. The language of shared work, of quiet evenings by the fire, of a hand-carved bird sitting on a shelf. The language of lilacs blooming in the spring. They had taken a story that began with a lie and a betrayal, and they had built a life on truth. They proved that sometimes the family you choose is the one that truly sets you free. And if you ever find yourself feeling like the second choice, the one who came late to the party, remember Maybelle. Remember that the right place isn't always the one that was meant for you. Sometimes it's the one you build with your own two hands. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the strange and the unexpected. You never know what secrets are buried just beneath the snow.